Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And I'm really pleased to be with you this morning. I hope what I will be presenting will be of interest. I know this is a very diverse community, but a lot of the work that we're doing in our centre is there are people within our centre that are part of the SeNSS network. So hopefully it does represent some of the work that you're doing too. And I wanted to kind of slightly expand the title I was given to talk about the role of society in a transition to climate neutrality, but also social sciences as part of that. So what do our disciplines offer, and what does the whole of society need to do? So very briefly, CAST, as I mentioned, we are a consortium of several universities, but UEA is one of them. The head office is at Cardiff, and I'm actually at Bath University. And we're a couple of years into funding. We have 5 years initially, and hopefully will be extended. And all of these logos at the bottom are just some of the organisations that we're working with. We're trying to be as applied as possible and to actually test out and deliver interventions with partners and see what works in the real world. The focus of our work is really to try and address this question: how can we as a society live differently and better in ways that achieve systemic, deep and rapid emission reductions? We focus on these 4 areas you can see here: food, heating and cooling, mobility and material consumption, because they make up the largest portion of our carbon footprint, and they've proven quite difficult to decarbonize historically, partly because they're wrapped up with kind of values and institutions and a lot of the things that social sciences shed light on. So there's a lot of social science to be done to actually make progress in these areas. And really crucially, we're focusing on the people bit of getting to net zero, to our climate change targets. Other people are focusing on the technologies, and we're looking at the kind of people bit. And really, it's crucial that there is to understand that there are so many roles that people play. So while the role of consumers is often the one that maybe policymakers might emphasize when they're talking about what people can do to help reach net zero, so they can buy green gadgets, for example, they can turn down the thermostat at home, some potentially small sounding changes as a private consumer. Of course, there's a lot more that actually people can do. So we're not only consumers, we're also citizens. We can vote, we can take to the streets and protest, we can write to our MPs, our politicians, our local councillors. We're also members of communities. We can do things at a local scale, potentially with people in our local area. We are maybe parents or members of wider family networks, so we can have conversations and we can shape the behaviour of people directly around us. Many of us have jobs, and so we are employees or maybe employers. And to different extents, there may be professional decisions that we can take that actually have quite significant impacts on the behaviour and institutions more widely. So what I'm trying to emphasise is that while there are certainly things that we can do to directly reduce our own carbon footprint, so we can drive less and we can fly less and eat low carbon diets, and those things are important, there are also a lot of other things that we can do to indirectly reduce emissions and help tackle climate change through the way in which we interact with other people, through our professional decision making. And so we're interested in change across all these different scales that you see on the right hand side, not only individual level behavior change. As a psychologist, that is the area that I tend to focus on, but colleagues that I work with focus on change at community level, within organizations like businesses, at cities and regional level, and at national and international level. So we're working across a range of different scales and trying to understand really what's the role of people and how can we mobilize change by people. I won't say much more about our centre, except just to flag that we have 4 themes. A visioning theme, which is really asking what could a low carbon transformed future look like? So here we're doing deliberative visioning workshops with the public, some scenario work, surveys and so on. In the second theme, learning, we are basically trying to draw on understanding of what has, how change has happened in the past and maybe happening in other countries and contexts and how we can apply that to understand transformation required now to deliver climate change targets. In the trialling theme, it's about actually testing out new ways of intervening to change behaviour, change organisations and policies across the scales I just mentioned. So that's where we're working with various partners. And the engaging theme is really about how can we embed transformation within society? How can we upscale some of these interventions that maybe work within theme 3? How can we upscale them? And how can we, as a research centre, actually be low carbon sustainable? So we're interested in being kind of quite reflexive and seeing how we can maybe help sort of show leadership, I guess, within higher education to lead, to do low carbon research. Though we're always keen to do better. And I think just it's worth pointing out as well, because I think this is relevant to sort of thinking about social sciences more generally, is within the work that we do, we are working across disciplines, so we are interdisciplinary, and broadly that is across disciplines within the social sciences. So we have psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, but we do also work with engineers, with people in the humanities and other disciplines, because it's really clear that with a complex issue like climate change, no single discipline can satisfactorily tackle it. We need to bring together the complementary insights from across a range of different sciences, including social sciences, and not just assume that they might be complementary. Often they are, but sometimes they can shed really quite different light and maybe actually be at odds in some ways, and there might be creative frictions between disciplines, and that in turn can be valuable. It can actually lead to innovation. So we know that from the sort of interdisciplinarity literature. So we're trying to embrace difference as well as synergy across disciplines. But crucially, we also work with societal stakeholders, with businesses, with local governments, with communities, with national government, and other organisations, and the public. And so in that sense, we are doing transdisciplinary research. So that's going beyond the sort of academic disciplines into society. Because we have co-design and co-delivery at our core. So we're trying to, understand the research needs of businesses, of government, of citizens, and to ensure that the insights that those groups have are informing the design and the delivery of our interventions. So we're very much drawing on kind of participatory science models, recognizing that we need diverse forms of knowledge where there are issues like climate change, which are complex and value laden. So this is very much kind of action research that we're doing in the main. And I think, I guess really the fundamental assumption underpinning a lot of what we do is that we need to go beyond just technological change to reach net zero. And we need to go beyond incremental change. Neither of those two things is going to be enough to get us anywhere near our climate change targets. We need fundamental societal transformation to tackle climate change. And this has come out of a lot of work, for example, the IPCC's 1.5 degree report a couple of years ago, and the Committee on Climate Change's various reports, including their sixth carbon budget that was published at the end of last year. It really shows how much change needs to happen. We need to reconfigure our urban environment, our transport and food systems, energy technologies, how we get goods and services. And because of the scale of change, a lot of that is going to mean huge disruption to our lifestyles. And it may also require a change in values and norms. So how we value the environment, how we think about social equality and our relationships and the role of the public in decision making, and a whole range of other sorts of institutions and values that are embedded, but maybe need to change if we're really going to effectively tackle climate change. So from the CCC's work, Committee on Climate Change, they estimate that about 60% of the measures needed to reach our climate change targets will involve at least some degree of behaviour change. Now, I would say that's actually an underestimate, because if you look at what's this 40% that is technological change, there are still human beings that are making those decisions about those technological changes. So they may be professional decision makers, for example, businesses and deciding where to get their energy from, or there might be decisions about kind of greenhouse gas removal technologies and other sorts of large scale technological changes. Well, there are still political or business decision makers choosing to make those changes. So depending on how broadly you define behavior change, if you're also talking about those professional decision makers, will probably say, actually, virtually all of the measures needed to get to net zero will involve behavior change. They will certainly involve the role of people. But even where measures don't directly disrupt lifestyles, which are probably what we could say this 60% refers to, they will impose risks and costs to the public, to the likes of you and I. So they're likely to increase our energy bills, for example. We may see changes in the landscape around us due to the sorts of different energy technologies and negative emission technologies that will be implemented. So even where we're not talking about cycling and walking more, eating less red meat, etc., we will still see changes that will impact us maybe slightly less directly. And we know from previous research and previous policy experience that we need to engage the public in decision making about those things as well. So really what I'm trying to say is that we can't have a net zero transition or transformation without the public noticing. We can't just rely on maybe having a few more wind turbines on the supply side, maybe some consumer nudges. Those things we will need as part of it, but we will need an enormous amount more than that. So we'll have to involve the public because there's going to be an enormous change ahead of us. And so what we need to do really is to build a social mandate for climate action. We need to have the public and society as a whole on board with these changes ahead of us. And we know that perceived fairness is one of the strongest predictors of policy support. Actually, in some of the work that we did a while ago, we found that the perception of whether a policy is fair was actually more important in terms of its acceptability than whether it was seen as effective. So fairness is really important. And fairness captures a whole range of things, including, whether some people are worse off than others, a sort of more distributional side of things. So we need to think about whether low-income groups, for example, might be left behind, or certain sectors. And so the idea of a just transition is part of this. But we also need to think about procedural justice. So actually bringing people with us and involving them in the decision-making about how to reach net zero. That procedural justice is just as important, and so we need to have a role for the public in decision making about climate change. And interestingly, it's not just that involving people in decision making makes it fairer and more likely sort of brings people with you and potentially makes it more acceptable. It actually improves the quality of decision making. So because you have a wider range of voices, you have more different expertise and backgrounds involved. So you diversify the knowledge that's being brought to bear. And so here I'm really talking about things like more deliberative and participatory activities like the Climate Assembly UK, which was the first UK-wide citizens' assembly on climate change that I was involved with. And these sorts of things are springing up all over the place. So at local level, you'll see there are lots of citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries happening now on climate change that help us and help policymakers to make better policies. So I think that's a really positive change that's already happening. But more widely, how engaged is the public with climate change? Well, we know that over the last few years, actually, concern about the environment has been increasing. And we've seen, although there were one or two peaks before that, and this sort of concern type curve that comes from, or graph that comes from YouGov polling, and there are similar sort of Ipsos Mori polls, that they often go up and down. They're susceptible to what's in the media at the time, like extreme weather events or political announcements. But what we have seen from actually many polls is that from about late 2008 onwards, we've seen a really steady increase in concern about climate change and environmental issues more generally. And that, I think, is due to a number of things. I think the IPCC report at the end of 2018 helped to accelerate concern. I think a lot of the protests that we saw, public protests, have certainly accelerated and drawn attention to the issue and made it rise up in people's set of concerns. And extreme weather events have been on the rise and reported more. And interestingly, while you might think, well, we've had other things to worry about for the last year and a half, actually, COVID has not dented concern about climate change. In fact, in some of the polling that we've done over the last year and a half or so, we've actually found that concern has slightly risen during the period of the pandemic. So the percentage agreeing that addressing climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency or a high level of urgency actually rose during 2020, somewhat surprisingly. But I think, you know, it can be explained by the fact that although we were also very concerned about the pandemic, this concern about climate change now has become quite entrenched. It's part of our core set of worries, and I think it's in the media a lot, and so it's not going away. We are still being reminded of it. But as I'll come on to, behaviour change does lag that concern, so we do need to think about how to change behaviour. But it's certainly reassuring that I think support for a lot of policy measures to tackle climate change has been growing alongside concern for climate change in the last couple of years. So the vast majority of people now, so this figure comes from some polling that we did right at the end of 2020 with the UK public, and we asked about whether they support the following measures to tackle climate change. And the sort of redder colours are support, and the greener colours are opposition, basically. You can see that buying energy efficient products and appliances, virtually everybody's on board with that. Walking, cycling and using public transport more instead of using a car, again, a vast majority support that. And even measures which just a couple of years ago, we probably would have seen a minority of people supporting, like limiting air travel. We're seeing large numbers supporting that. And similarly, even a small majority, I think that's about 56%, saying we need to reduce the amount of meat in our diets. So while there are certainly some areas that we need to maybe grow public support, because these are all things that we need to probably do to tackle climate change, I think these are really encouraging indications that the public is largely behind taking bold action on climate change, and that the recovery from COVID should be green as well, so that they don't see a trade-off between addressing the economic challenges that we face over the coming years and tackling climate change. So there's, broadly speaking, people are sort of seeing that these can be win-wins. I've kind of touched on this, but the sorts of behaviours that we do need to change and that we're focusing on, as I mentioned in CAST, are these four areas, and these percentages relate broadly to how the proportion of the carbon footprint that they account for. So about a quarter from food, a quarter from travel, and so on. But while I'm not going to say too much in this talk about adapting to the impacts of climate change, because that's a little bit outside of the work that we do, we do need to change there's a big role for people, of course, here as well in adapting. So we need to encourage people to prepare more for the impacts of climate change, including flooding, heat waves, and so on, that we're going to see more of in the UK. And when those impacts hit us, to respond in the immediate and the longer term to those issues. So to adapt their behaviour to cope with things like heat waves, to potentially to evacuate dangerous areas, and so on. So there are a lot of behaviours that will need to change in relation to climate change. And so just for the last sort of few minutes, I wanted to talk about really, well, how do we change behaviour? And this is really a focus of a lot of the work that I personally do. And we can kind of categorise behaviour change interventions into downstream versus upstream. You can categorise them in other ways, but this I find quite useful. Downstream is where you're influencing individuals' choices directly. And this is really things like information provision are the main sort of thing that we're talking about here, including adverts or labels, also kind of more social approaches where maybe you're kind of trying to persuade people through various sort of social network norm-based approaches would come in. This is really where you're trying to shape people's decision-making directly, get them to think differently, maybe inform them, give them the facts or persuade them in other ways. Well, those may work to some extent. And so you might, for example, want to, this is an example from a National Trust menu in the Lake District, where they trialed out putting carbon emission figures against different menu items on their menu. So you can see that a lamb and damson stew has a much higher carbon footprint than some other things like chips. So have chips, it's lower carbon. Well, we know that red meat is the highest emitting type of food. So this kind of at the point of decision making, providing information to remind people or inform people for the first time that these sorts of things are more impactful on climate change is quite can be influential, at least for people who are concerned about climate change. Now, not everybody is, and there might also be, in many situations, lots of barriers to changing people's behavior, even if they know how to do it and they have the intention to do it and the motivation. And so upstream interventions are where we're changing the context or the situation of action. So here's where a whole raft of different sorts of measures come in, like economic measures, changing the prices of things, providing subsidies and so on, changing the availability of products and services. And sticking with the example of food choice, so studies have shown that if you just increase the proportion of plant-based foods on a menu relative to meat-based choices, you can significantly shift people towards those choices. In other words, you don't even take away the choice of meat, but you simply expand the role of the number of plant-based choices on the menu, and people are much more likely to choose those. So making low carbon products and services more available will help. Changing the built environment is also key, as I'll come on to. So we know that a huge factor that shapes our behavior is the physical environment and infrastructures more widely. And we might say that maybe education and changing social norms kind of comes in here, it kind of comes here also, but this is about where we're really changing sort of the values of society, so that maybe more fundamentally we're thinking differently as a whole, and those are sort of feeding into the value context, if you like, of our decision making. And so just to sort of elaborate, really, while we know there are information gaps in how people understand taking action on climate change and what's most effective. So from some earlier work that we did across a number of countries, we asked about how effective do you think the following things are, or rather, yeah, what impact do you think these actions would take in terms of protecting the environment? And we could see that actually things like turning off the tap when you're brushing your teeth consistently came top, whereas avoiding eating meat, contacting a politician came generally much lower. And while it's difficult to actually quantify the impact of contacting a politician about an environmental issue, it's interesting that avoiding eating meat came much lower, when that is one of the most effective things that we can do actually to reduce our carbon footprint and to protect the environment. And probably turning off the tap when brushing your teeth would be one of the least effective things. So we know, and this is just one example, we know from studies more generally that people tend to not really be aware of the role of eating meat and dairy, and of the role of consumption. So embedded emissions, the emissions embedded in the goods and services that we buy, people are not very aware of the impact of those things on climate change. And they tend to think that recycling, for example, maybe turning off the tap and brushing your teeth are very effective, when they're not generally. So there are misperceptions. So there are things that we can do to correct those with information. However, information can work in maybe sometimes not very predictable ways. So it can actually work to polarize opinion. In some studies that we did a few years ago now, we gave people some information about climate change. These were newspaper editorials that we'd sort of mocked up. One was a sort of climate skeptic piece. One was a more mainstream, kind of verging on the alarmist piece. And we gave a group of participants these two editorials to read. And what we found was that people who, prior to reading these articles, we'd identified as being quite skeptical about climate change, they reported becoming much less convinced about climate change, having read the articles, whereas the people who basically did believe in climate change said they became slightly more concerned about climate change. So evidence to some extent that reading the same two pieces of information, actually people just picked the information that reinforced what they already believed and rejected the information which challenged that. And so we know that this sort of confirmation bias is pervasive. So people tend to gravitate towards information that reinforces their views. So it can be quite difficult to change people's attitudes when they feel like they've made up their mind. And that's because information about climate change is sort of, or indeed any issue, is filtered through various sort of biases that we have, various heuristics and frames and so on. So we perceive climate change in different ways according to our values, our beliefs, our background, and so on. And so within this context, the best way in which we can communicate climate change more effectively is to target people's values, is to use these filters and frames to our advantage. We've done this, we've looked at this in a number of studies. And so we found, for example, that messages about mitigating climate change, so reducing emissions, tended to be more effective for those who already had a high level of concern about climate change, whereas messages about adapting to the impacts of climate change was more effective for people that were less concerned about climate change. And it may be that this group who were already concerned found it less threatening to think about that mitigating, which involves kind of changing behaviour and so on. Whereas thinking about the impacts, maybe this is a more kind of potentially about protecting yourself. And so whether you actually do care about climate change or are concerned about it, you might start to think, oh, this is something that actually relates to me personally. We've also done this in different ways where we've tried to segment audiences according to their politics. And what we found is that people with left-leaning politics tend to prefer justice type narratives aligned with their sort of core values around equality, whereas those on the right tend to prefer messages around patriotism or being frugal and not wasting. And although these differences, I should say, are actually relatively small, they are significant. And so despite the fact that this is just reading a small piece of information, we do find differences in these groups. And it's interesting looking at examples of where this has been applied more generally. So Oxfam had a campaign a few years ago called For the Love Of. And what that got you to do was on an interactive website, you would put in some information about something you cared about. And I, of course, put in chocolate. You could have put in something about cricket or the place that you lived or something else. So very wide range of different sort of things that you might really care about and value. And it would tell you what the impact of climate change would be for that thing. So I was very sad to read that the impact on chocolate is going to mean disrupted supplies, potentially that we won't have access to very much chocolate in the future. So when you start to talk about climate change through the lens of things that people care about, it starts to make people pay attention and potentially be willing to do something about it. And this has been done more widely, this is used very widely in marketing research, segmenting audiences according to their values and trying to market products in green ways to green consumers and in other ways to other consumers. We know that works. And even in the workplace, trying to get measures, environmental measures, they're more likely to be accepted if they resonate with employees' goals, like saving money or getting more exercise. So really the key point here is that if we can talk about climate change in ways that are that resonate with core values that people have, and ideally that highlight co-benefits. In other words, that actually this will save you money, or this will be healthy for you. Then it's more likely to appeal to a much broader people, because those are values that are held very widely. And actually, this might be one that is less known, but actually, because there is because consumption actually doesn't generally sort of correlate with psychological needs and well-being. So what we know from the literature is that while to a certain extent, the more we earn, we can improve our well-being, it meets our basic physical and psychological needs. Actually, at a certain level of income, happiness or positive affect or life satisfaction generally tends to level off. And so the more you earn, it doesn't mean that the happier you are. And we know this from numerous studies, and that materialism actually tends to negatively affect well-being. So one of the messages that we're interested in testing is whether actually talking about the well-being benefits of a low carbon lifestyle might be quite persuasive for a lot of people, because I think one of the biggest challenges we still face is this sort of pervasive consumer mindset and the assumption that consumption will make us happy. So we need to challenge that. And just finally, on information, we can also do a lot to build people's sense of self-efficacy and collective efficacy. So if you highlight that people like you are taking action and that leaders are taking action, we found that people are more willing to take action because they feel that their efforts are part of a collective a collective sort of set of actions, and then that feels fairer that they're actually doing something themselves. Oh, and and finally on information, and we can use social norms to shape people's behavior as well, through telling people. There are some classic studies in which you may be aware of this if you've done any psychology, that giving people information about what a majority of other people are doing can be very effective in persuading people to do that thing. So reusing towels in a classic Goldstein study, 75% of guests in this hotel reused their towels, led to a significant adoption of that behavior, reuse of towels versus a standard environmental message, just talking about the importance of saving water. And this has also been found within the university context in terms of reducing car use as well. But I've spent a bit of time talking about information because, as a psychologist, that tends to be one of the tools in our toolbox that we are most familiar with. But we know that information alone often is not the most effective way of changing behavior. In fact, it's one of the least effective. But it is important in combination with upstream measures. So we need to change the context in which people act, and so we need to change the urban environment to favour walking and cycling, for example, have more cycle lanes. We need to apply potentially economic measures like congestion charges to help shift incentives away from, say, car use to walking, cycling and public transport. So we need all of these measures as well, and they tend to be more effective actually than information provision. But the final thing I want to say is around getting the timing right. So this is really one of the emerging areas of research for us. We know that habits are a major barrier to lifestyle change. Actually, we do the same thing over and over again, and we don't necessarily weigh up alternatives. And so, we can see that maybe in the supermarket, you're maybe slightly on autopilot, or certainly in terms of transport use, you tend to travel to work or university using the same mode of travel, and you don't really think about alternatives. But habits, while they are usually a barrier to behavior change, when they're weaker, they provide opportunities to then more effectively reshape people's behavior. And they can be weakened during what we call moments of change. And so that includes things like moving house. So once you've moved house, you're in a completely new physical environment. And so you will need to figure out how to travel to your workplace, to the shops, etc. And so you're in a much more deliberative, conscious mode of decision making relative to when you have a habit. And at that point, if you intervene, you can more effectively change behavior. So in one classic study, researchers gave some information about the local bus service and a one-day pass to try the bus for free a few weeks after a group of residents had just moved house, compared to a group of residents who had not recently moved house and who they assumed had more entrenched habits, travel habits. And what they found was that the people who had recently relocated increased their bus use very significantly, from 18% to 47%, whereas the people who hadn't recently moved house didn't significantly increase their bus use. So this is the same intervention was given to these two groups, but it only effectively worked amongst people whose habits had been weakened by this move, this moment of change. And so there's a huge opportunity here, I think, then to intervene more effectively to times when people's habits are weaker, to when they might be more open to doing new things. And so we need to build that into our interventions. And of course, we've been using this opportunity to look at COVID as a potential disruptor to people's lifestyles. Now, we know we've been acting in very different ways over the last 18 months or so. You know, we've been traveling an awful lot less for various things, for work, for shopping, etc. Our surveys show that people say they've been saving energy and water in the home, that they've been wasting a lot less food. So they've been using up leftovers, and that they've been checking what's in the fridge and making sure that they don't waste food in various ways. And they've been consuming less and spending their time in ways that generally are lower carbon than how they used to spend their ways, like more gardening, more creative hobbies, things that have generally a lower carbon footprint. And what we found from these surveys actually is that while, of course, there are, people are keen for the restrictions to be lifted in many ways, they have found that some of these behavior changes have been positive in many ways. So and many people are keen to retain some of these changes in the longer term. So, for example, people are keen to do more working from home if they can, to waste less food, to cook more for themselves, to consume less, and so on. So a lot of these changes people have actually found quite positive in many ways. But the key thing is that, because I've talked about the downstream and the upstream, that even with the best will in the world, if the context is not supportive for people's intentions to live low carbon lifestyles, it will be very difficult for them to do that. So we need to lock in these good behaviors, these good environmental behaviors, with appropriate infrastructure, incentives, norms, and so on. We need all these diverse policy measures to support those changes. So just finishing up then, I think I wanted to emphasize that radical social and behavioral change is essential for reaching net zero emissions for our climate change targets. And how can we do that? Well, we need to engage with people to build a social and political mandate. We need to understand what's important to people and build their values and fairness into policies. We need to design interventions with co-benefits in mind. In other words, we need to ensure that they deliver well-being benefits, health benefits, equity benefits, and so on. And because those are things that are important to people, so we need to ensure that we're achieving these wider social goals. We need to implement interventions across different levels and multiple interventions as well. So we need information, but we need pricing, we need different city design, regulation, and I've touched on kind of the need for transdisciplinary social sciences to achieve that. So we really need to work not only across disciplines, but with societal stakeholders as well to really get this right, get these interventions workable. We need to change social norms. So leadership is really key, and spreading good practice through networks. And I think what's really interesting is when to intervene, not only how, we're starting to understand what works most effectively, but also when is the best time to intervene. So at points of decision making, like buying a car, but also maybe when habits are disrupted, when you've moved house, when you've retired, or COVID, of course, as potentially a really key moment of change. So I'll stop sharing now and welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I'll give them the students a couple of minutes to type their questions onto the chat. I can take chair's privilege there and ask a relatively provocative question. So you've talked about the need for a radical change, and I think we all know that people's behavior, changes incrementally and most of the time very, very slow. And I think COVID-19 has made, it was a disruption basically that forced people to change. So do you think that through that incremental change, we can resolve the climate emergency, in the next 100 years, which is effectively, the timeline we have, or do we actually need another COVID-19 crisis to shift people's behavior radically?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we don't really have 100 years to solve this. We've got about a decade, if that. We've got a few years in which we really need to significantly change behavior and wider society. So the time frame in which we have to act on climate change is shrinking, actually. And while what we've learned from COVID is that, yes, governments can intervene and radically change our lifestyle overnight. But the trade-off there was that there were massive impacts on the economy, well-being, etc. So we don't want to tackle climate change in that way. What we want to do is to have a more planned transition, but plan it as quickly as we can. And we've already done a lot of planning. We've had a lot of public deliberation. We're starting to test out interventions. So we're starting to get the evidence for what works. We now just need to deliver those interventions. And we've got political targets in place. We've got 78% reduction in the next sort of 10 years or so. We now need to just start putting in place the policies to deliver that. So so I think we want a more planned transition, I think, than the COVID one.
Okay, I think following on the provocative pattern, Dan has asked, and he's saying, thinking about values, having children is often assumed to be a positive thing, and I don't doubt that it is in many ways. Would taking the decision to be a child-free member of society have positive environmental impacts if enough people change their values this way? Or might be a negative impact, that is worth considering?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's analysis by Wines and Nicholas where they tried to quantify the emission reductions of various lifestyle changes. And by far the most effective thing that they found was having one fewer child. It dwarfed everything else. And, next was kind of cutting down on, I think, aviation and car use and red meat consumption. And that's because obviously, a person, bringing a new person into the world is then going to consume resources and energy and so on. So yeah, it is a hugely environmentally beneficial thing you can do. It's obviously just an incredibly difficult thing it's one of these taboos, which, and until recently, even talking about reducing meat consumption was a taboo. Reducing aviation is still sort of politically quite difficult to talk about. So I think, the having one fewer child is a really difficult sort of thing to talk about, but it is absolutely an incredibly environmentally beneficial thing to do.
Yeah, I think there are implications there in terms of the demographic, pensions and things like that. That it's one of those things that it won't resolve.
I mean, I probably should emphasize actually income relates to that. So I wouldn't want to get into this thing of kind of like population, relating this to population in poorer parts of the world, because as somebody in our country, if they were to have one fewer child, that would make a massive impact. But in a poorer part of the world, they consume almost nothing. So yeah, just to clarify that.
Jonathan, I want you to your comment on the transport decarbonization plan, which says that it was not about stopping people doing things, but about doing them differently. And there was always, a speculative bet on future technology enabling this kind of doing differently. And he's asking whether you think this sounds like dodging the behavioral change elephant in the room, or is there an alternative option?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was on the advisory panel for developing the DfT's decarbonising transport policy, and it gave me a really interesting insight into what factors they have to kind of weigh up when they're developing policy. And I think what came out yesterday, the final policy, was interesting, and it's a huge step forward on previous transport policy, which was this based on broadly predict and provide. So they predict growth in car use and aviation, and so they build more roads, they expand airports, and they have actually moved away from that broadly in this new policy. So they're talking about modal shift. They're talking about moving people out of cars onto bikes, public transport, and more walking, and that's a really key element. And they're talking about a lot of technological change, and so more electric vehicles, for example. And yeah, so to answer your question directly, I think they have got a bit of behavior change in there because they've got this modal shift. They recognize that we do need to do things differently and change our behavior in terms of driving less and using different modes. But what they haven't incorporated at all is reducing demand. So, and that even wouldn't have been too difficult, given that since COVID, we are traveling less for work. So actually there is reduced demand. So how can we lock that in? I mean, they missed a trick in terms of saying, we'll work with employers to encourage people to have more flexible working patterns and work from home and reduce commuting and have, less business travel. That could have been addressed quite easily, but they didn't touch that. So reduced demand is not in that for land travel, nor is it there for aviation. They basically said, we're going to wait until a magic technological solution arrives to decarbonize aeroplanes and not at all tackle demand, which is frankly quite worrying. So they have somewhat addressed behavior change, but definitely not as fully as they could have done.
And I think following the same pattern, Deborah has put there that she thinks it's hard to change people's desire for a car in the UK. And I think she links that with the infrastructure support. You talked about demand change. I think there's also an issue with, how do you help people, if there are plenty of buses, like the example you've used, if there is proper train transportation, if it's, cheap, then you would change people's behavior much easier. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So prices are a part of it. And so we need to basically, and they have got this a little bit in the DfT's policy, but they're talking about making buses much cheaper. But what we need also is to make train travel cheaper than aviation, for example, so that it's not cheaper to fly up to Scotland compared to taking the train. So prices are a big part of that. But the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, is also really key. So it isn't enough just to provide a better bus service. You also need to disincentivize car use. So you need to make less parking available. You need to actually reallocate road space so that there's a one lane less for cars and one entirely for buses or bikes or both. So you need to make it more difficult for people to drive, as well as improving the alternatives. And that way you kind of break people's habits and you shift the incentives and facilitate behavior change. So we haven't got that happening yet. It is starting. I mean, I would challenge the car use thing, because I think people are buying cars less now than they used to. Particularly young people, and they are starting, they're preferring either to get an Uber or to car share. So the more we can have those car sharing options available, I think the more that also provides alternatives for people. So there are some encouraging signs, but we definitely need more along those lines.
Chloe takes it a step further, asking whether you think radical changes like banning the ownership of private cars, for example, instead of buying one, lease one, or car share, of course, with exception for people with disabilities, or banning the production of meat and dairy products might be necessary steps.
Well, unfortunately, I think those things have negative consequences in a number of ways. So for one thing, like the meat one, for example, I mean, already the farmers and people working in the livestock industry are really anxious, rightly so, about their future, their livelihoods, and what climate change policy is going to mean for them. So we need to manage this transition, this net zero transition, carefully, thinking about what it's going to mean for people working in some of these sectors. And we definitely do need to eat a lot less red meat and dairy, but we need to think about what's going to be the role of those farmers. And so we have to do this in a way that is doesn't just completely put huge amounts of people out of work. And I think as well, in terms of public support, we know you would not have the public support to just ban meat consumption. Even a meat tax is the sort of thing which gets a lot of people up in arms. So I think we do need incentives and disincentives to encourage people to shift. But I think we need to bear in mind, actually, we're living in a democracy, so we do need to listen to what people want as well. And while, many of us are maybe, happy not to consume meat, there are people for whom that's a really important part of their life. So we need to incentivize people to eat less meat. And I think we wouldn't have the public, we just have protests on the street if we tried to ban meat, and same with the car use. And I think it's not only disabled people that would not be able to potentially get around, like rural communities, they need cars, broadly speaking. It's very difficult not to have a car. So we need to encourage these people to have electric cars if possible. So I think car use, we need less of it, but I think banning that, and same with the meat, I think it doesn't need to go quite that far.
Talking about public support, Felicity is asking that, there are surveys, and you talked about them, that show that there is public support for certain measures. The question is, does this in principle support result in changes in practice, or is it just a simply different thing? We're looking at about attributes when it comes to surveys, and then the behavior of people is very different in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. There is often a gap between people's intentions and their behavior, or their policy support and their behavior, and for various reasons. Partly it's because, as I've kind of mentioned, really, even with the best will in the world, and you say, yes, I would really support people not driving less and me not driving less. If it's difficult for me to get to my work without driving, then, if there are physical barriers and other sorts, economic barriers, then I would love to, but I can't act on my intentions and my attitudes. So there are often gaps. And I think that's why there's a limitation to what we can infer from surveys, because we also need to ask about, well, are there reasons why you might not kind of act on this and recognize that gap?
Kathy is looking at the externalities. The question she's asking is looking at the externalities. So, for example, COVID-19, has a radical change, working from home, but at the same time there are negatives. Well-being may deteriorate, inequality of choice, especially frontline workers versus the rest. Technology is important in terms of the cost of developing broadband, which might actually then have negative implications for climate change. So, could you talk us a bit about those externalities that you might see?
Yeah, I think it relates to your first question about kind of like managing what can we draw from COVID and relate that to climate change. There were definitely plenty of, so many negatives associated with COVID and with the policies to tackle COVID. But this was sort of an emergency situation. So it was sort of difficult to, I guess, implement measures on an incredibly short time scale that would be effective in limiting infection without having some of those knock-on consequences, I guess. With climate change, while we definitely have a short time frame, we have a little bit more time to plan these in ways that reduce those externalities and trade-offs. I think it's the case that we really need to exploit co-benefits. The IPCC has done a lot of work to actually map and quantify the co-benefits from climate action. So the health co-benefits, like a low carbon diet, for example, is incredibly good, achieves lots of health co-benefits. Walking and cycling, equally health co-benefits. And I touched on reduced consumption has wellbeing benefits. And there could be many economic co-benefits from many of these net zero changes in the government's 10-point plan. It's very much about the economic co-benefits. So we need to look for those co-benefits and exploit them, and then communicate them, because then we'll actually enlist support for these changes if we can sort of highlight our lives will be better in many ways if we do this right. So it's not inevitable that tackling climate change will achieve co-benefits in the same way that there were plenty of trade-offs to COVID, but that we can look for those and identify the best solutions that do achieve the most win-wins.
Zoe is asking whether, because you mentioned a few times raising prices in your presentation, and she's asking, do you think that this is biased towards higher socioeconomic status groups, and should we expecting these people to make later change?
Oh, okay. So I guess there's a couple of parts to that. I mean, the people with the highest income are the biggest polluters. So if you look at sort of graphs of how income relates to carbon footprint, it's a pretty clear, very strong relationship. So the highest earners are the biggest polluters. So it is the case actually that people with highest income do have the most that should be changed. But equally, they are probably the ones that if you only relied on prices, that they would probably be able to change their behavior. So what we need to do is basically implement measures that make it cheaper for people to adopt lower carbon lifestyles and make low carbon choices, and more expensive to do the bad things. So we do need those in place, and we need to think about, but those by themselves will not be enough, because there will always be people that can pay to have the expensive polluting thing. So that's why we also need tougher, to some extent we need some regulations, and we need innovation, and we need infrastructure and other things to ensure that even the rich can will end up changing their behavior as well.
I think Beth gives a slightly different twist to what you just said there. And she says that she doesn't think there's much public info campaigning that links the broader global issue of climate change to the health effects of local pollution, like asthma deaths in children in built-up areas. And she considers that a good route to tap into, the sense of fairness. She's then referencing Naomi Klein's book on climate change, with the stark examples on problems in pregnancy in polluted areas in the US. And, she's asking whether you have any thoughts on why that isn't on the political agenda, perhaps.
I think in some cases it is. It's interesting if you look at some London boroughs where they suffer from very high air pollution, where they're trying to implement low traffic neighborhoods, which is very divisive in many communities. So this is where you sort of basically reduce the amount of traffic going through, and but encouraging walking and cycling. Huge health benefits, environmental benefits, even business benefits from these measures, by the way. But communities are kind of sometimes resistant to reducing car use. Where some London boroughs have wanted to implement these measures, partly they've reframed them around livable neighborhoods, but in some ways, in some cases, they've also really emphasized the social justice and equity aspects of this, because the people that are living on the most polluted roads are usually the poorest people, and they are often the people that don't even own a car. And so when you look at kind of who are the winners and losers from these sorts of policies at the local level, that basically those on the lowest income are going to be potentially benefiting the most, and people that might be slightly inconvenienced are maybe the richer people that have multiple cars. So when you frame it in that way, actually emphasizing this is about protecting these poorer people and people that have, are not even causing the pollution, actually they found that can be quite effective. And I mean, it will of course also depend on probably the political affiliation of your audience, and so it might appeal maybe more to people on the left, but it's difficult, it's difficult to get away from the fact that a lot of these measures will improve life for people on the sort of lowest income. So I think at the local level, sometimes that can work. I think at the national level, we have a government that maybe talks about levelling up and other sorts of social justice measures, but doesn't always sort of follow through. So it will also depend on the political party in power. And at the moment, it's very much about innovation, green jobs, and the economic sort of benefits that they're focusing on. And so, so we have to sort of maybe adjust our messaging, maybe to talk about some of that when we're talking about those, talking to those stakeholders.
There's a very interesting debate happening on the chat function that students respond to each other. So I'll try to focus on the questions. We've got time for one or two more. Alba wants to ask how you think the work of the Climate Assembly could be moved forward, and what role these bodies could continue having beyond the one-off.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I think already the Climate Assembly UK has helped to give a bit more confidence to UK policymakers to take climate action. So because so many of the recommendations that came out of that were, I think, beyond what policymakers thought that the public supported. And then there is also quite a lot of pollings more widely that suggests that it's not just those 108 members of that particular assembly that supported these measures. Actually, a lot of the support is wider than that as well. So I think it's starting already to have an impact on policy, which is great. And the more we can then sort of use that as a springboard to sort of say, well, you know, the public is behind this, and then, you know, other societal stakeholders hopefully can have more confidence to enact change. That's what we need to do. And then moving beyond the one-off, we do need to have more than, because this was a snapshot in time. This is what we found last year when we engaged with people. The world has changed since COVID. So, you know, we do need to continue to engage with the public, and particularly on specific policy measures. So, you know, we need to understand, what do people think about low carbon neighborhoods and low traffic neighborhoods and so on, and ideally at that local level have that sort of engagement.
I'll take the final question from Beth. Basically, you talked about social sciences in your presentation, and Beth is wondering about the role of arts in addressing climate emergency. She's reading Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, and that has increased her sense of urgency. And she's asking whether there are ways to encourage the making of more TV and films that bypass people's defensiveness in thinking about what climate change might look like for future generations. So how do you see the role of other disciplines in that climate emergency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think definitely we've done a little bit of work looking at the role of arts. And it can be really effective, partly because it engages people on an emotional level, which we know can be a very powerful motivator and sort of bypass people's kind of slower, sort of maybe more rational thinking. It resonates on a more visceral, deeper level. So I think it can engage with a lot of people very effectively. And depending on the precise sort of medium, it can also just get people outside of their day-to-day lives to kind of think about climate change in a way that maybe they don't necessarily sort of have time to reflect on normally. So I think it can be incredibly powerful. So yeah, in short, I fully agree. We need to engage with the arts to more effectively engage the public.
Right, we're just on time. So it remains for me to thank you very much for your keynote address, for handling all these questions coming from different perspectives. And on behalf of SeNSS to thank you for your participation to our annual conference.
Thank you very much indeed.